In July 2025, the villagers of an eastern Ukrainian village slept under blackout curtains as their dogs barked loudly outside. It was 4:17 a.m., and the night sky was still heavy with mist as a lone pilot walked toward a machine that should not have been capable of what it was about to attempt. His aircraft wasn't new nor glamorous. It wasn't even supposed to survive the night, as it was a relic of the Soviet Union. It was an old, rusty MiG-29 whose bones were older than the pilot. But strapped beneath its wings were weapons never meant for. Precision-guided bombs, wired into the old fighter with cables and codes. The villagers sleeping under their blacked-out curtains had no idea what new peril war had brought to their doorsteps. The pilot's mission was to strike a Russian military base that until now had been untouchable. The base was heavily guarded by layers and layers of radar, surface-to-air missiles, and fighter patrols. It was rumored that no Ukrainian jet could ever break through this fortress. The mission to strike it was not just insane but suicidal, and yet it was already in motion because the Ukrainian military know that if they can have any chance in this war, then they have to prove a point to the Russian army that its power was not infinite, and its military is not indestructible. Its bases, its strongholds, its pride could still suffer at this stage of the struggle. But this was not a random military base. It wasn't going to be an easy task by any stretch. The base in question housed stockpiles of missiles, command systems, and surveillance equipment. But more importantly, it was symbolic. It was the forward operating hub coordinating drone and missile strikes on Ukrainian cities. Every night from this base, coordinates were sent that would rain destruction onto civilian homes hundreds of kilometers away. To hit it would be Ukraine's answer to the Russian army. It would be sending a message not in words, but in fire. But the problem wasn't finding the target. The problem was surviving long enough to strike it. By 4:20 a.m., the pilot climbed the ladder into the cockpit. The MiG's canopy shut him tightly inside a capsule of steel and glass as he prayed silently. Outside, mechanics gave final hand signals as the pilot's eyes flicked across instruments never meant to guide this kind of mission. A glowing iPad, bolted in place with tape and brackets, carried the targeting data. American GPS signals carried coordinates through Ukrainian code translators. French bombs armed themselves with silent green lights. It was a Frankenstein's monster of technology. Soviet airframe, Western weapons, and Ukrainian ingenuity. And tonight, it would either write history or be swallowed by it. At 4:26 a.m., the twin RD-33 engines roared to life. The ground trembled, lights flickered, and the jet rolled forward into the mist. The countdown had begun. Every second was now precious. By 4:29 a.m., the jet was airborne, clawing into the sky, its engines tearing through the silence of the countryside. But this wasn't a climb to safety. It was a dive into danger. The pilot had to stay below 50 meters, at treetop level, where the Earth's curvature would hide him from Russian radar. That meant no autopilot, and absolutely no margin for error. At this altitude, a single lapse of focus could turn the jet into a fireball. The jet weaved through power lines and antennas over wheat fields at 3,900 kilometers per hour. Every obstacle the pilot faced was just death sitting milliseconds away. The cockpit rattled and the airframe moaned as the jet went. It wasn't built for this kind of stress. Yet the pilot's hands stayed steady, dancing across stick and throttle, coaxing the jet through a deadly ballet. Russian radar stations sat just across the border, their operators unaware of the ghost tearing toward them. At higher altitude, the MiG would have been visible from 400 kilometers away. But down here, hidden by the horizon, the jet was invisible until it was almost too late. And that invisibility was his only shield. At 4:41 a.m., the first danger point was a stretch of territory covered by S-400 surface-to-air missile batteries. Russia's national pride, these are capable of striking targets at 300 kilometers with deadly precision. If the pilot popped up for even a moment, he would be painted, locked, and destroyed before he had time to breathe. So he stayed low. So low that wheat fields bent under his jet wash. These were the longer minutes of the pilot's life. They dragged on like hours. Sweat rolled down his back, soaking into his flight suit. His grip on the stick was firm, but never tight. Too tight, and the aircraft would respond with jerks. Too loose, and the jet would fly him instead of the other way around. By 4:48 a.m., he was within 60 kilometers of the target. The base lay ahead with its defenses as solid as ever. It had dozens of launchers, radar domes turning silently like predators sniffing the air, dozens of searchlights waiting for the alarm, and fortress walls believed to be practically impregnable. To strike it, he would need to break his invisibility, and at 4:52 a.m., the coordinates flashed across the iPad taped to his panel. The moment of truth was here. The bombs needed altitude to hit with precision. That meant climbing straight into the teeth of every radar screen in the region. The plan gave him only 22 seconds to rise from ghost to target, release his payload, and dive back into cover before the S-400s, the Pantsirs, and the book launchers painted him in neon and tore him from the sky. He pushed the throttles forward. The MiG screamed upward, clawing altitude with raw defiance. From 50 meters to 5,000 in a single punishing surge, the G-forces crushed his chest, pressed blood into his legs, blurred the edges of his vision. And at that exact moment, across the border in Russian bunkers, alarms lit up. Screens painted the sudden apparition of a Ukrainian jet, where no jet should have been. Officers began to shout orders, and suddenly fingers were hovering over launch keys. But the jet was already there, already in position. At 4:53 a.m., the pilot squeezed the launch key and the pylons clunked, and the jet shuddered as two French-made bombs detached from its wings. They tumbled for a heartbeat before their guidance systems ignited. Small fins snapped open, lights blinked alive, and the bombs locked onto the GPS coordinates fed through Ukrainian code. The pilot didn't wait to watch. He couldn't even if he wanted to, as every radar screen within 300 kilometers was on him. He slammed the stick forward, diving hard, dragging the MiG back into the Earth's shadow before the missiles could find him. But behind him, chaos had erupted. Russian radar operators shouted overlapping commands. S-400 batteries lit up, their launch rails tilting skyward. In underground bunkers, officers demanded answers. Where had this jet come from? How had it slipped through their surveillance? Fighter patrols scrambled from nearby airfields. Engines began howling awake in a frenzy. But the bombs had fallen already, and at 4:54 a.m., the first detonation shook the horizon. A column of fire erupted from the Russian base, the blast wave tearing outward like a giant mushroom. The bomb had struck the munitions depot, a warehouse stacked with missiles, shells, and ammunition. 1 second there was silence. The very next it was a cacophony of explosions in a chain reaction. Less than a minute later, the second bomb hit. This one tore through the communications hub, the nerve center of the base. It had antennas toppling like matchsticks, radar domes collapsing into smoking ruin, and consoles sparking, screens going off, and with them went to coordinate the very defenses that should have stopped the strike. For the Russian soldiers who survived the first blast, panic hung in the air like a stench. Some fled toward bunkers while others fired blindly into the sky. Nobody could comprehend what had just happened. That a single Ukrainian jet, decades old, had pierced the shield of the most fortified base in the region. And yet the strike wasn't only physical, it was psychological. The explosion didn't just destroy buildings, it destroyed certainty. The certainty that Russia's bases were untouchable, the certainty that their defenses were perfect, the certainty that Moscow has Ukraine in the palm of their hands. Back in the MiG, the pilot had no time to celebrate, and Russian fighters were hot on his tail. Surface-to-air missiles streaked upward, searching for a target that was already gone. Hugging the terrain, the Ukrainian jet vanished once more into the folds of the earth. At 4:59 a.m., he was a ghost again. By 5:02 a.m., the Russian airspace was chaotic. Fighter jets scrambled in all directions, hunting a ghost they couldn't find. Radar operators adjusted dials, recalibrated, screamed into headsets, but the screen that had once shown a Ukrainian jet was now empty. Explosions still rumbled like aftershocks, and black smoke hunting the air, visible for miles. By dawn, satellite images would confirm what Russian commanders already feared. Warehouses were gone, radar arrays pulverized, dozens of vehicles were destroyed, hundreds of tons of ammunition were turned into ash. And then came the footage. Somewhere near the base, villagers had filmed the explosions from their phones. and within hours into the new sunrise clips of flying missiles, rising flame and thundering explosion sounds filled the internet. By the time it hit Western news broadcasts, the whole world had seen Russia's fortress reduced to fire by a single jet. By 7 a.m., the Kremlin issued its first response. Although furious, they tried to downplay the damage. They claimed the losses were minimal and blamed NATO for supplying weapons, then promised retaliation. But the words couldn't erase the images. Inside Russia, whispers spread. How could this happen? What else was vulnerable if their most defended bases could burn? Then maybe nowhere was safe. Inside Ukraine, the effect was the opposite. Civilians in blacked-out cities shared the videos, whispering that maybe, just maybe, Moscow wasn't invincible after all. And for the pilot, still flying low across Ukrainian fields, still guiding his battered MiG toward home, the weight of it pressed heavy. He hadn't just carried bombs, he had carried a nation's last hope. By 5:21 a.m., he crossed back into Ukrainian-controlled airspace. His landing would come later, in silence, at a remote strip carved from dirt and concrete. Mechanics would swarm the jet, peeling open panels, checking damage, preparing for the next mission. The impossible had already been done. The strike wasn't just a military success, it was a turning point. A message carved in fire across the horizon that Russia was not untouchable. Back in Moscow, the Russian Ministry of Defense scrambled to draft statement after statement, each more panicked than the last. Generals convened in secure rooms, their voices raised, pointing fingers at each other, demanding to know how decades of defenses had been undone by a single aircraft cobbled together in a Ukrainian workshop. The intelligence chiefs pushed the blame on electronic interference and NATO satellites, but none of it could conveniently explain how their prized fortress had been breached. In Kremlin corridors, silence hung heavier than the smoke over the burning base. Vladimir Putin's closest advisors knew what this meant. The myth of Russian invincibility may not have been scattered yet, but cracks spread fast. At 9:15 a.m., state television aired carefully edited footage, showing the base from selective angles. It showed firefighters spraying water and soldiers carrying crates. The anchors spoke as calmly as possible in a bid to dismiss the strike as minor damage. But outside the official narrative, videos from villagers kept circulating. Entire neighborhoods had seen the fireball rise. They had heard the thunderclap of explosions and watched missiles firing off like fireworks in random arcs. No speech could erase what they had witnessed with their own eyes or seen on the circulating videos. By noon, analysts in Washington, London, and Warsaw were studying satellite images of the strike. Pentagon briefings were now talking about game-changing improvisation. NATO planners, long cautious of escalation, suddenly saw the possibility that if Ukraine could stitch Western technology into Soviet frames and do such great damage, then the war is far from over, and escalation is definitely looming on the horizon. What other Russian bases, depots, and command hubs could now be at risk? And what is Russia planning for retaliation, as surely Putin would never concede to defeat, especially one coming with such public humiliation? But perhaps the most important ripple was not in maps or military plans, it was in morale. On the streets of Kiev, people gathered in small groups despite the air raid sirens. For the first time in months, headlines weren't about Russian drones raining down on apartment blocks. They were about a Ukrainian jet striking deep into enemy territory. The smiles on their faces said it all. A glimmer of hope had been restored in their hearts. In the trenches near Bakhmut, soldiers passed phones from hand to hand, replaying the same shaky videos of the explosions. Each blast meant fewer missiles aimed at their cities, fewer drones guided to their positions. Each flash of fire was proof that they weren't only defending, they were also striking back. For the pilot, though, there was no cheering. By 10 a.m., he sat in a makeshift debriefing room with his flight suit soaked through with sweat, his hands trembling slightly now that the adrenaline had ebbed. Across from him, intelligence officers took notes, asking questions he could barely remember the answers to. The mission had been measured in minutes, but it had aged him years. When he closed his eyes, he could still see the flash of fire blooming across the horizon. He could still feel the crushing G-forces of that climb, the weight of gravity and fear pressing the breath out of his lungs. He could still hear the distant roar of the base erupting, not as victory, but as confirmation that he had risked his life for a message larger than himself. And yet, he knew the war wasn't over. Retaliation would come. Russian bombers would strike back. He knew cruise missiles would arc across the border, hammering Ukrainian power stations, command centers, and civilian neighborhoods with nukes. Although all of that was inevitable, although he knew the strike was far from ending the war or even shifting it in the favor of Ukraine. Instead, it had provoked the Russians even more. He knew it was all worth it. The restoration of hope in the hearts of his people was worth all the risk in the world. Because the war was not only about weapons, it was about belief. The belief that Ukraine could endure and that Russia could be wounded, even against impossible odds. This is the kind of story that reminds us why hope matters, even in the darkest moments of war. Here at Ocean Alert, we explore the tactics, technologies, and turning points shaping modern conflict. Real analysis, real implications, no filter. Subscribe if you want to understand what's really at stake. What would you have done in that pilot's seat? Let us know below in comments. And of course, stay Ocean Alert.